which doeth great things, past finding out, yea, the wonders without number. Lo, he goeth by me, and I see him not. He passeth also, and I perceive him not. Behold, he taketh away. Who can hinder him? And who will say to him, what doest thou? It's a fascinating little passage. He begins here by saying to Bildad, and I suppose to Zophar, he says, or Eliphaz, I should say. He says, I agree with you. Well, he didn't agree with everything they said, did he? But there's something that, at least, that he agreed with. What they had been saying, and I don't know that I can point to just one particular phrase, but the general theme of those first two speeches was what, basically? What about the friends? What was their speech? Well, they thought Job was a sinner. He didn't agree with that. Yes, sir.
That was basically it. That it was because of his wrongdoing that he was going through what he's doing.
But the remedy they suggested was what?
Confess his sin.
You just get right with God, your life will be a whole lot better. And Job says, yeah, I'd be glad to be right with God. But how can a man be right with God? If I can't be right with God, how can a man be right with God? I spent my whole life serving and devoted to him, so you tell me. Oh, it'd be great to be right with God. Yes, it would be, but how does that happen? I think that's the tenor of those words there. God's wiser than we are. Well, yeah, I know he's wiser than we are. I understand that. That's verse 3. If he will contend with him, he cannot answer him one of 1,000. You don't know what God knows. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who's hardened himself against him and prospered? Nobody. I understand that. You can't be stubborn against God. I know that. I agree with that. I'm talking about the greatness of God in verse 5, 6, and 7, which removes mountains and they know not, and overturns them in his anger, shakes the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, and commands the sun and the stars not to shine. I think that phrase, in his anger, suggests the idea this is not the creation, but rather a judgment. I don't know if it's judgment in general. Does he have a specific judgment in that? Could this be a reference to perhaps even the flood? It doesn't mention water. But he does talk about mountains being moved. I can imagine a lot of mountains were moved in the flood, wouldn't you? A lot of land got moved then. He talks about the sun not shining and the stars, the idea of the blotting out of the sun, the stars in the flood, and the rains that would have been connected with the flood. I don't know. But anyway, obviously the idea is, here is the judgment of God. When God judges, who can stand against that? But he does talk about creation. Not just from the standpoint of blocking out the stars, but God also set them in their place. Which alone spreads the heavens. Verse 8. He spreads the heavens. You ever notice how many times in the scriptures we find references like that? God alone spreading the heavens. So go over the book of Isaiah for a moment and just notice with me a couple of references there. Isaiah 42 and verse 5, I think it is. The greatness of God is emphasized by the prophet Isaiah in these words. Thus saith the Lord, or thus saith God the Lord, that is the Almighty Jehovah, He hath created the heavens and stretched them out. He that spread forth the earth and that which comes out of it. He gives breath unto the people upon it and spirit to them that walk therein. God spreads out the heavens and makes the earth. Look over in the 44th chapter of Isaiah, verse 24. Thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, He that hath formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, and that spreads abroad the earth by myself. God stretching out, as it were, the sky. the heavenly bodies, all that's there, the universe. In the 45th chapter of Isaiah, verse 12, again he comes back to this point. Verse 11 beginning, thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, ask me of things to come concerning my sons, and concerning the work of my hands command ye me. I have made the earth, and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded. We think about the vastness of space, and people still marvel at the size of the universe. And they use numbers that are just meaningless to me. They're so big and so enormous. And God claims that I'm the one that stretched out the heavens. So how big is God? I created the universe. And that's what Job acknowledges here. How can a fellow win a feud with the one who stretched out the heavens alone? God only can claim that. Back in our text down, Job 9 and verse 8, which treads upon the waves of the sea. You have another translation of that? Verse 9 there. Treads out. Trample. Yeah. The idea behind that word seems to be of suppression, of control. To tread on another is the idea of being superior to another. We think about the sea, and we think about the power of the sea, the majesty of the sea, if you will. But it's God who created the sea. That's another reference we find periodically in the scriptures. In Psalm 104, in verse 9, I'm going to start with verse 1. Psalm 104, in verse 1, the psalmist wrote, bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who stretcheth out the heavens like a curtain, who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters, who makes the cloud his chariot, who walks upon the wings of the wind, who makes angels spirits, and his ministers of flaming fire, who laid the foundation of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. Notice verse 6. Who coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hastened away. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys, unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they may not turn again to cover the earth. You know, we think about the glory of nature, the power of nature. I think all of us have been amazed. We marvel. You go down to the ocean, or you see somehow the works of God. But remember, it is God who created all those things. And his superiority over his creation is obvious. But that point is made over and again. Look at Jeremiah chapter 5. The greatness of God as seen through nature, if you will. Jeremiah 5 and in verse 22, I think it is. Fear ye not me, saith the Lord. Will ye not tremble at my presence, which have placed the sand for the bound of the sea by a perpetual decree? It shall not pass, as though the waves thereof toss themselves, yet thou canst not prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over. God set the boundary of the sea, and there it will be. But it's God who is in charge. It's God who is above all those things. The Lord, through his creation, shows us something of his majesty, of his greatness. And so Job recognizes all of that is so. He talks about not just the sea and the mountains, but also the stars. This is the passage where he mentions in verse 9, the Pleiades and Arcturus and Orion and the chambers of the south. These are constellations. They picture for us, well, people have organized it in different ways. Some have suggested directions, that these are different directions in which we might look in the sky. Others have talked about different seasons. I know that Orion is a winter constellation. You can't see it this time of year, at least where we live. But the idea is that in different seasons and different places all through the sky, you look and you see the stars, and they're so impressive, and they mesmerize us. But it's God that made them. He is above all things. The power of God is, I think, what he's emphasizing here. In question through verse 9. Look at verse 10. Verse 11, I should say. Lo, he goes by me, and I see him not. He passes also, but I perceive him not. What do you think Job's saying in that passage? Yes.
Well, if we aren't paying attention to all these great wonders of the universe, we may not be tuned to the fact that God actually made these things. He made the sea, he tramples on the sea, made the mountains, and yet he passes by, and we almost never see him. We don't see him.
Okay, and you make a good point there. But do you think that's where Job is? Is Job a fellow who doesn't recognize? No, not in this case. That's not Job. Job says, I recognize all that, but what does he not see? Yes, go ahead.
I think he realizes God is in like a different realm, if you will. He's spiritual. He's, with all this power, and he could be right in front of you and you wouldn't know it. If God wants you to see him, you see him. If he doesn't want you to see him, he will not be seen. He has that, that majesty and power about him that he can be there and not be perceived.
Okay, all right. Now, Justin, you had a point.
Yeah, I was just gonna say he's, we don't see him, Job don't see him, but he's always around. He always knows what our thoughts are, what we're doing. He's always there. And I don't know, it's not a difficult verse, but it's I guess it could go a couple different directions. But to me, it's just like we may not be in the mindset to perceive him, but he's there. He's always there. He always knows what we're doing. That should motivate us and make us cautious and careful that he's always around. He's always there.
And I appreciate the point you're making. Let me ask you, look back in verse 10. Talking about God. He does great things, pass by the gap, wonders without number. Wonders without number. Think about all the wonders that God does today. And every day. God's working everywhere. He says, I know that son. But look at verse 12, the next verse after our passage. Behold, he takes away, and who can hinder him? Who will say to him, what doest thou? He is uncorrectable. He is above correction. And he certainly is taken away from Job, hasn't he? So maybe the spin on these words in this particular case would be something like this. I know God works everywhere, every day, all the time. I know that. And I know he's taken away from me, but I can't find him. I can't find him. I pray and I don't get an answer. And I know he's there, but I can't see him. And maybe it's a little more, poignant, really. That what Job is saying, in effect, is that I know we serve the God that's everywhere, but he sure doesn't seem to be around when I need him. Yes, sir.
He talks about it later on, I think, where he wants to plead his case before God,
Sure.
So God's not there. But
Yeah.
He'll eventually get to meet him.
Yes, he will. And that's it. I don't think Job's correct. I think God was there.
Oh yeah, he was.
There's no question. I want y'all to talk about. He was there. He was there.
And something's interesting. He has these questions in his mind where he ask God. God don't answer his questions.
Yeah.
You know, God, where was you when I done this? God don't answer his questions, that's just to satisfy you.
Right.
You know, he just says, you know who I am.
Yeah, and I think that's really critical. You know who he is.
Who I
Not
am.
just, it's not just,
I don't owe you no explanation.
but it's not just a dismissiveness, is it? It's the idea, if you really know who I
I
am,
know who I am.
then you know. Then you know what you need to know.
I think, and that seems satisfying.
Yeah, I think certainly.
I think he finally, he kind of maybe forgot about those things he wanted to ask, and, you know, he realized, you know, I'm just nothing, here I am, God speaking to me, and, you know, it's not important.
There's another factor there, isn't there? We'll talk about this as we go along. But in our passage here, doesn't Job say God's great? Doesn't Job say God made the star and made the, yes. I mean, he's not so silly he doesn't know that. But I think it's possible to intellectually understand there's a creator, but I think it's also possible for us, if we're not careful, to lose the goodness of God. And how that God doesn't just work in judgment. God works everything, you know, for good. So that's something I think we'll see as we go along.
I mean, when we pray, are we not asking God to do things for us?
Surely.
I mean, every time we pray, we're asking him in some way to help us, in whatever way our petition may be.
One of the great lessons of the book of Job is to really understand that expression, if the Lord will.
Yeah.
I think, don't you, that's really the trust involved in those words to say, whatever it is, I'll accept it.
Yeah.
This is what I think I need, and this is certainly what would please me right now, but whatever it is, I'll take it. And that's, Job was a guy who could talk about that. That was all, yeah, good. Somebody else have a thought? Okay. So, verse 13, beginning. I think Job feels himself to be in the hands of an angry God. You guys remember that? There's a famous sermon preached by a colonial preacher. Was it Jonathan Edwards? Sinners in the hands of an angry God. You ever seen that or heard that? He was an old Puritan preacher, fire and brimstone fella, and he preached it. You find copies of that sermon still around, you know, print. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. I think Job feels like he's in the hands of an angry God. And he feels that he's the target of God. And he'll talk about that. He talks about it here. In verse 13, if God will not withdraw his anger, the proud helpers do stoop under him. How much less shall I answer him and choose out my words to reason with him? Whom though I were righteous, yet I would not answer, but I would make supplication to my judge. And if I had called, and he had answered me, yet would I not believe that he had hearkened unto my voice. For he breaks me with a tempest, and multiplieth my wounds without cause. He will not suffer me to take my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If I speak of strength, lo, he is strong. And if of judgment, who can set a time to plead? If I justify myself, my own mouth shall condemn me. And if I say I am perfect, it shall also prove me perverse. Let's pause there just a minute. You know, Job says, you know, God, the ESV reads, God will not turn back his anger, verse 13. Beneath him bow the helpers of Rahab. How can I answer? Choosing my words with him. That's a curious expression of the people who wondered about the book of Job, this idea of the helpers of Rahab, or the helpers of the proud helpers. The word literally is Rahab. Rahab means proud or defiant. That name is one that is used in the prophets sometimes to describe Egypt. Egypt is a proud nation. But the word is more general. I don't think it's just Egypt he's talking about here. I don't think Job has in mind Egypt when he writes or when he speaks. And I'm not sure exactly who he may have in mind, whether it's some specific rebel, as it might seem, and if so, which one. there have been through the years a number of rebels that have been vanquished by God, mighty though they were. I think about that passage in 2 Peter chapter 2. He talks there about how the whole world was banded together against God when God brought the flood. And maybe Job again has that in mind. Or Peter also talks about the angels that sinned were cast down to hell. Excuse me. And some have suggested that maybe this is a reference to that original rebellion. I don't know that I can say who the proud helpers are. But whoever they were, Job says they were great and mighty, and if they didn't have a chance against God, then how much less can I have a chance? Now that lesson is cleared up. It's impossible to win against God. And he said, I know that. I recognize that. And that's why Job feels like he's in a no-win position. God has made me his enemy. Again, Job did not consider God to be Job's enemy. But Job felt like he was God's enemy. When you're God's enemy, do you have a chance? There's no chance. And I can't win. The ESV in our passage reads, though I'm in the right, I cannot answer it. I must appeal for mercy. If I summoned him to answer me, I wouldn't believe that he was listening to my voice. Now, I'll tell you, in my humble judgment, I think the 9th chapter that we're in right now represents the lowest point to me for Job in terms of his thinking, his frustration. He lets words fly in this chapter that are outrageous. And I think he's speaking here in bitterness and frustration, saying in effect, whether I'm right or wrong, God's marked me for destruction, and there's nothing I can do about it. He said if he answered me today, I wouldn't believe he was really responding to me. That is, to be fair, to hear me. He's already decided. He will not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If it is a contest of strength, how are you going to win that with God? Though I'm right, my own mouth would condemn me. I'm sure that he'd find a way to trip me up. I can't win. Though I am blameless, he would prove me perverse. I am blameless. I regard not myself. I loathe my life. You can tell a fellow who's just at the end of his rope and who feels hopeless and in despair about his circumstances. Let me suggest we go over the next 2 verses to finish out the lowest of the low points. When Job basically says that, there's just no justice in the universe. Verse 22 reads, this is one thing, therefore I said it. He, talking about God, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. If he If the scourge slay suddenly, he will laugh at the trial of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof. If not, where and who is it? Now those are hard words. In the ESV, it's all one, I say. He destroys both, blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. You talking about God? The earth is given into the hand of the wicked, and he covers the faces of the judges. If it's not him, who is it? Who should we see about it then? Well, I think we might have an answer to that. Who else is involved in this process? Well, of course, Satan is. But maybe the response would be, but who allows Satan to do that? In the end, if God said no, it wouldn't happen. And so in Job's mind, it just comes right back to that. The world is just filled with wickedness, and who should we see about that? Well, what shall we say about that? It pleased the Lord to bruise him. Remember that phrase from Isaiah 53? It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He had put him to grief. He was talking about his own son there, wasn't he? What kind of God is pleased to bruise his own son? His own innocent son? What kind of God would do that? What does that mean? Yes, sir.
There's a difference in someone doing something, we're talking about God here, and them allowing it to be done. You know, the devil, like you brought up before, you know, the devil is involved in that. God can do whatever he wants to do, but he's allowed things to happen throughout time in various forms. Just like the Lord there, he allowed that to happen, but it was great benefit.
That's it. That's the reason. Why did it please the Lord to bruise him? He hath put him to grief. But thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin. He shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. That's why it pleased God to bruise him because he enjoyed seeing something. It pleased God because he saw this as a means to get him where he needed to go. That's the critical thing. And that's what Job will learn. That's what he will come to know. But God does allow, does he not? These things. Yes, sir.
Well, in there also, you know, you say, you know, you got to think about the son as well. The son was willing to do that. He was in harmony with God on that. He realized that his suffering would bring that. So it's not like God's like making his son do that. It's a joint effort there. And so when you put it in that context, you see that it's not God like, you know, forcing somebody into something. His son was willing to and wanted to do it.
That's true. Was Job willing to do it? He volunteered for what happened to him?
No.
Okay. So sometimes that's not a factor. But Mr. Clark writes about this. He says, is it not most evident that the worst men possess most of this world's goods? That the righteous are scarcely ever in power or affluence? This was the case in Job's time. It's still the case. If God does not permit these things, then who orders them? You have to recognize the fact that God at least allows these things to be so. And when Job said, using the word God laughed at it, that goes too far. God sometimes is pleased that suffering takes place in view of the end result.
Well,
Yes, sir.
I think that's, I think you're exactly right. I don't know that I've always, I was thinking of this passage, where in James 1, when he talks about count it all joy when you suffer all those different trials.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know that I go, man, this is just great. You know, I really enjoy this, you know, but I don't think I can reason for that. It's the fruit that it will bear.
Right.
You know, it's not, you know, there's things, and I've said this before, there's things I have learned when my back is against one I didn't know what to do.
Right.
And I don't think that I can learn no other way of going through the fire.
Right.
It just changed for the good.
And yet I'll pray every day, Lord, keep me from trouble.
Yeah.
And it might well be that the Lord said, Wesley, you desperately need trouble. You desperately need it.
It's
And when he gives it to me, then I'll spoil and cry and kick the ground. So this is the kind of immaturity that Job sweeps away. That for me.
well, he brings impurity to the top.
Yes.
You know, when you're dealing with steel and stuff like that, and you put certain things in it, it will make, in order to make it pure, you turn the heat up and you add things to it to get the impurities out of it. So that might be what some of these things might help us in our Christian walk.
Yes, sir. But I'm sitting here, lived my whole life in a tub of butter. But if that changes tomorrow, will you have the fortitude and the strength to learn the lesson from Job and to say, I trust God regardless. And that's what Job's going to
Whatever our circumstances, he is still worthy of our us to worship him.
That's the great lesson of Job. So several people, I'm sorry. Yes, yes, sir.
One thing of that verse where when God loves, he chastens.
Yeah.
And no chastening is pleasant for the moment.
Right.
The end result is what you look for.
Very
To
true.
grow.
Anyone else have a point? Yes, sir.
Kind of to piggyback off of Wes, you know, it pleases the Lord to see his righteous servants when we, even today, you know, fall flat on our face, we still look to the Lord to help us through it, for his guidance, for his direction.
Right. Absolutely. But in this case, I think where Job is right now, at this moment, Job is not seeing that. Job is feeling like, I've tried my very best to serve God, and the world has caved in on me. And I tell you, as far as I can see, there's no difference in good or bad in the world. Brother Haley put it this way. He said, if I interpret correctly, we've understood these verses correctly. Job denied that there was a moral government of the universe, a view that he could not continue to hold. And I don't think he did. I don't think Job really believed what he was saying here. I think he was frustrated. I think in a moment of frustration, these words flew out of his mouth, and they should not have. They should not have. But certainly, the words represent a discouraged viewpoint that says, what's the point in serving God? Because good and bad, he's going to bring them down and laugh at the good when it goes down. That's too hard, and it's not true. When a good person, this is the CEV, when the good person dies suddenly, he said, God will sit back and laugh. Nobody here believes that so. I don't think Job really believed that, but he said it. You ever said something you shouldn't say? In a moment of frustration?
You know,
And doesn't take very much, you know, sometimes. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking off my head where it says that he didn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked. You know, that just don't make him happy that, you know, if somebody dies and they're lost.
No.
Even though they made that choice.
And he certainly doesn't rejoice in the suffering of the righteous. Do you rejoice in the suffering of your children? That's what the Lord might ask us. God set up the family to teach us about how much he loves us. So when your children suffer, you ever say, good, I'm so glad. It may be that their suffering is something that will help them, and we recognize that. Sometimes we might, as this person pointed out a while ago, inflict pain in order to teach a lesson or to try to, and punishment. But it's still not pleasant. If it's not for us, it's certainly not for God who perfects love. Yes, sir.
You know, even in all this, God did put a limit on how far Satan could go. I mean, you know, so even in this, you know, you gotta remember that, and God knew what was gonna come out of it, so.
He was never forsaken, but he certainly felt it here. That's right. That's right. So this is maybe the worst thing Job ever said. God sits back and laughs at the problems of the righteous. But it was not a lasting conviction. The question that I want to ask, and maybe we'll take too much time with this, but I think this is an important point. What should we do with these harsh words of Job? You know, there are those who would tell us that this is a good thing. What Job did was a good thing. Gibson talks about gross irreverence, unparalleled in the annals of literature. The fiercest atheist cannot hold a candle to a distraught believer when he gets going. For the present, Job's God has removed himself from an earth where might alone is right, and he's sitting laughing at the result in heaven. These rebellious, thoroughly blasphemous verses in which Job turns wisdom, orthodoxy on its head, mark the nadir, the low point of his alienation from God. This same author seems to think that's okay. He goes on to tell a story about a young father who was on his way to the hospital to visit his little daughter who was stricken with cancer. It was her birthday. He was carrying a cake for her, and he passed by a church, and although never devout, he entered in to pray. Later, he arrived at the hospital a block or two away, and he was told that his child had died. He didn't say the Lord gave and the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. He immediately returned to the church and flung the cake at the crucifix behind the altar, scored a direct hit, and the sticky icing trickled down on the Savior's face and shoulders. The story was later told on the radio, this story was. And the commentator offered this strange verdict, calling the father's hurling of the cake a, quote, profoundly religious action. Was that a profoundly religious action? The whole thing, of course, is caught up in denominational nonsense. But, you know, is it a good thing to scream at God? One fellow wrote, "He who doubts God's concern for justice is at the same time confident that God is just." I'm not smart enough to understand that. But I think I get the implication of it. That it's really, you know, you really show your faith when you scream at God, when you say blasphemous things. I believe good people suffer. And I believe we ought to be patient with those who are in suffering. And I recognize the fact that sometimes even the best of us will say things in moments of suffering or moments of trial that later we come to regret. They don't really represent what we believe, and we ought to be patient with each other. So understand, I'm not suggesting anything else. But I would say this, that when Job was later praised for speaking right about God, I don't think chapter 9 is what he had in mind. I don't think everything that he said was right. Railing against God is not a virtue. Jim McGuigan wrote a commentary, or a book at least, about Job, and he's a brother in Christ. He knows something about suffering. And I thought he made some good points, and I don't usually do this, but I'll read a couple of notes from his, and then we'll close today. But Brother McGuigan, his book wrote, "Shattered people, or those in deep depression, say things they never dreamed possible. And they learn things about themselves they could not possibly have believed until the pressure became intense. Deny you? Never," said Peter. "They might, I never will," and then a cock crows. So that's a good reminder of humility. He goes on to say, the book of Job isn't written to urge us to rage against God as Job does at times. I hear some people say that if you don't rage against God when you're in pain, that your faith isn't authentic. I believe that's rubbish. We aren't to grovel. That's clear from Job. But to sacrifice God on the altar of our own self-righteousness or our pain is the other extreme. He's the sovereign Lord, and the book of Job makes that clear. I don't think God's made crystal, he goes on to say. And I don't think he's going to fracture if we rant or rave against him. God is long-suffering, slow to wrath, filled with compassion. The question here is not, quote, will God forgive us when we're in agony and scream and snarl unjust accusations at him? That's not the question, will God forgive us? The question is there anything to be forgiven? I believe Job was wrong to accuse God in such a scurrilous way as he did in chapter 9 here. When God finally speaks to Job out of the storm, he rebukes him for his unbridled speech. God admired and loved the man, but he rebuked him when he sinned. Jeremiah also accused God of being an unfaithful deceiver, Jeremiah 15. God rebukes him for it by saying, quote, "If you repent, I will restore you that you serve me. If you utter worthy, not worthless words, you will be my spokesman," Jeremiah 15:19. Listening to some speakers, I sometimes get the feeling that there's no such thing as blasphemy. I do not think it is either right or healthy to teach people that it's all right for them to use God as a punching bag if they're in real pain. And I think that's well said. There are those who take a different view about Job, but I think that represents the truth. You have a question, a point, or a reaction to all that? Yes. Go ahead, Donald.
I just say, I appreciate the fact that God lets us see the low point of Job, not to glory over him, but it's a source of strength for us that when trials do come, we see, hey, this is not the right path to take. Even though, you lash out, you gotta be, even in that, you gotta use restraint, and then you gotta step back and use wisdom to go, wait a minute, I really know who God is, and this is not characteristic of God.
Right, exactly. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, you know, Joe makes mention that he realized I said some rash things. You know, I said some things I shouldn't, that you know, like you said, out of frustration and just pain and all that's involved there. He realized I said some things that I shouldn't have said.
The reason I took such time with this is because you will find people in their interpretation of Job who will say, now this is the way we ought to do with God. If you don't like something, just rage against it. That's not what we glory about. Job is not praised because he raged against God. Job is praised because when he didn't understand, he never quit. That's what the New Testament praises Job for, his endurance, not in these very unwise words. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's